I have a question for you this morning. Did you enjoy history at school? Well, whether you did or whether you didn't, here's a very short, quick history lesson. And it will help put this psalm into a little bit of perspective for us this morning. David is king of Israel. Saul is dead, and David has been king for some time. David may have been a man after God's own heart, but he didn't always get things right. Following his affair with Bathsheba and the death of the child that relationship had created, God had this to say to David. In 2 Samuel 12:10 he says, "Now therefore the sword will never depart from your house. Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity upon you." Ouch! Be warned. What God says happens. Absalom is David's son. These days, we would describe David's family unit as quite dysfunctional. Absalom and David have a really strained father-son relationship. It's quite a story, and it reads like an episode of Days of Your Life. Not that I've ever watched it, but we all know what it's like, don't we? And I don't have time this morning to give you their relationship in full. Just to say that Absalom was the eldest son and by rights probably should have inherited the throne when his father passed away. But David had already decided that his son Solomon was the heir to the throne. So consequently, when Absalom decided that he actually wanted the throne and he was going to take it by force, and he proceeded to do that. He proceeded to make preparations to take the throne from David by force, even before King David had died. And he then went around persuading the people to be on his side. He gathered an army together, and Absalom was ready to come after his father and kill him with a sword. Do you remember God's promise? Or God's warning to David? I will bring calamity upon you. The sword will never depart from your house. David, here he was, once again, forced to flee from his life into the wilderness. He found himself in a dry and thirsty land, and he knew that it was some of his own doing that had got him there and got him into that place and in the predicament he found himself. Lake Eyre in the middle of Australia often looks like this. And I'm thinking that many of you listening this morning have lived in the country region for many years, and you understand the consequences and the look of a severe drought probably better than I do. At some time or other, we've all found ourselves wandering in the wilderness, whether of our own doing or that of others, or a combination of both, or sometimes just things completely beyond our control. We have found ourselves lonely and alone in the wilderness. Some of us have been there back there again and again. So David's words in verse 1 ring true, don't they? My soul thirsts for you. My body longs for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. Can you hear the longing, the aching in David's soul? Can you feel the hurt and the tears in David's words? Picture yourself in this desert. See the heat as it shimmers up, the lifeless plains, the seeming lack of vegetation and animal life. Life itself is dry, falling apart, longing for water. Have you noticed that in some of our most devastating times, when we feel spiritually dry, we long for a sense of God, and yet he can feel in those moments so distant? So I sat thinking about that and I wondered why. Why is it that when I feel most alone and devastated, do I feel that God is missing? Even when everything within me recalls verses and thoughts from God, words from him, we know mentally that God is faithful and he will never renege on his promise of his presence. So why do we feel alone? And the only answer I came up with is that's exactly how Satan wants me to feel. He wants me to believe that I am alone. And if I think and believe it long enough, I'll begin to listen to my thoughts and my plans to find a way out, to curse God and move on as Satan would want me to. But, and I love the buts, but my relationship with God calls me to a better and a higher place. David knows it. He says, "Oh God, you are my God, and I earnestly seek your face." And as he says these words, David begins to look inward, upward, backward, and forward to restore his fellowship and his closeness with God. So when he looks inward, as with any rehabilitation, first we have to come to the realization of admitting where we are. There is power in the acceptance of the need of God. And until I recognize and respond to my inner need, I act as if I have no need. My heart tells me that God will not pour himself where he is not wanted. I read somewhere once that God is the ultimate gentleman and he will not enter until given permission to do so. Somewhere in this crazy world of political correctness, I think we might have forgotten this. I'm not talking about navel-gazing or a poor me attitude. I'm referring to an honest, open, inward appraisal of my need of God. Verse 2 says, "I have seen you in the sanctuary and beheld your power and your glory." David recalled his time in worship where he saw and enjoyed the presence and the power and the glory of God. In the days we're living in, through this COVID-19 crisis, we're not worshipping in our four walls, in our physical church building. We seriously miss it. We are all missing it. Just this week, talking to several people, we are missing that physical getting together. But I would earnestly encourage us all to remember God is present in our worship, in our homes. Wherever you are right now, God is present. And when we remember God is present in our worship, it helps us to keep us alive to his glory, in his presence. It reminds us over and over of all he is. And then David started to look up. So often we are tempted to do the opposite. We look around and we look down at what is happening rather than looking upwards. If we remember the Samaritan woman at the well, when she was looking down into the well, she didn't find what she needed. It was only when she looked up into the face of Jesus that she found what she was looking for. Verse 6 says, "On my bed I will remember you. I think of you through the watches of the night." Remember, meditate, ponder, anything that helps you focus on God. Watches of the night can mean in the midst of the darkness of what you are already facing, or it could mean 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning when everything seems so much worse and much more overwhelming. But if we refer to verse 6, it was exactly then that David began to focus on God, on what God had done, on his loving kindness and faithfulness, on the times when God was there to help, on God as a sustainer, and on God as protector. So he was focusing upward on God, our refuge and mighty fortress. And then he began to look back. One of the easiest ways to trust God in the present is to remember and recall his help in the past. In verse 7, he says, "In the shadow of your wings I will rejoice." There David stands behind God as a small child. As a small child stands behind the protection of his parents. That's where I see David thinking he is in the shadow of God's wings. Verse 8, "My soul follows close behind you. Your right hand upholds me." Glue yourself to God. Years of closeness to God now helped David when God seemed far away for him. God's right hand signifies power, and David encourages himself as he recalls the power of God that he had both seen and witnessed and experienced in the past. When he did that, he once again realized God was his protection, his pattern, and that helped him to look forward. And David had to go through the progression. Looking inward, he saw his spiritual lacking. Looking upward, he sees God's sweetness and God's presence. And looking backward, he once more finds God's sovereignty. So that looking forward, he finds God's strength. Before anything could happen, David declares that in God, the victory was his. The odds were completely against David. He only had a small band of followers and he was facing Absalom with a great big army. But David exercised trust in the future faithfulness of God. And that's our example. Perhaps it's called living by faith and not by sight. If David had depended on what he saw, he would very likely have been defeated. But he refused to do that. My soul longs for you. My body longs for you in a dry and thirsty land where there is no water. Just maybe that's how it's been for us in recent days and weeks, perhaps especially now as Melbourne Metropolitan has been locked down for a second time. Many of us cannot visit our families again for at least 6 weeks. And I'm feeling that after taking my mum home just over a week ago, and I can't get to see my grandchildren again. There are some of you listening that are even living in the lockdown again. All of this can begin to feel like a dry and parched land. Remember Lake Eyre? This is how it looks after it rains. Some of the farmers said following this particular rainfall that they will now have feed for their animals for 12 months because of the rain. This is the way Jesus puts it to the Samaritan woman when she looks up from the well and into his face. He says to her, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give him will never be thirsty. Indeed, that water I give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. As we continue in uncertainty and in uncertain times, it's time to thirst for God in deeper, richer ways. God will always meet our needs, just as he did David's, in ways that are often unimaginable. If we could only look in, look up, look back, and look forward. God is ever present, all around, always. And we just need to remind ourselves of his truths and allow ourselves to drink of the ever-flowing waters of life.